Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and today I'd like to take up more of an academic or historical topic, which I'm going to try to keep simple so that Catholic parents can follow and benefit from the content of the video. I've been studying the history of classical Christian education for 27 years now. I started in 1995 when I was 20 years old, and I've been at it full time ever since then. And my conversion to Catholicism was included in that 27-year history, and I can say that my pursuit of this knowledge of the history of Christian education is an important part of what led me to the Catholic Church as an adult. I can't express to modern Catholics enough. I can't make it clear enough. I can't emphasize it enough that we are living in a Christian dark age. Learning in our society, learning in the 21st century is so greatly inferior to the learning that was present among Catholic scholars, Catholic priests and bishops of the past, that it's just impossible to comprehend the difference that exists intellectually, culturally, philosophically, and so on. And what I'd like to do in this talk is provide some of the history of one period of Christian history that's extremely important. And it's the period right around the time of the Protestant Reformation, when learning, I would argue, in English society was reaching its peak. And it was doing so in the Catholic Church just as the movements were at work, which were responsible for the events that would lead to the destruction of that learning in centuries to come. We're living in those centuries to come where that learning that had peaked at that time has been lost because of the popular movements that were allowed to spread through modern developments like democracy and Protestantism. So I'd like to share some of the fruits of my research and contemplation and help Catholic parents learn to appreciate a particular period in Christian history and learn some new names that you're probably not familiar with, but I'd like for us to become more familiar with. Now, to provide some overview here, as we get into history and the history of education, there are a few sources that provide us with a history of these subjects. They're historical documents themselves. There's one book that's written by an old Anglican schoolmaster who was teaching in the 1700s. His name was Charles Hoole, Hoole. He wrote a book titled I think it's A Rediscovery of the Old Art of Teaching, and this again was written back in the 1700s. And in that book, he includes a lot of reference material for textbooks and things like that were used. The Jesuit Ratio Studiorum, which was published in 1599 by the saintly Jesuits at the time, right around the time of Ignatius of Loyola and Francis Xavier and the rest of the original Jesuits. They published the Ratio Studiorum, which taught the entire program of study that was promoted by those Catholic saints in the 16th century, and it was done consciously in response to the modern movements that were at work in the world, in Europe at the time, the rise of modern scientific method and its influence on schools, the rise of Protestantism and its influence on schools. So we can go back into history at this period of time, and we can find lots of resources in English translation, but mainly in Latin, on this period of history and education and what was done. And as I said, the learning at that time, the quality of the education, the schools, the culture was so high, and it was ultimately destroyed by a number of different modern movements: Protestantism, the scientific revolution, the rise of democracy, and so on. So let me share some history. If we go back, it's always important just to remind ourselves of the great date posts of world chronology, which I teach the kids in the Academy World Chronology course. The Roman Empire, we can say, fell around 500 AD, and the medieval period began. So from 500 AD until around 1500, we have the period of history known as the medieval period, which is derogatorily referred to as the Middle Ages, because it suggested that the period before and the period after were superior. If we study it, though, as Catholics, we find that the opposite was actually true. The Middle Ages were actually the Golden Ages, and the periods both before and after were inferior. The period after that we're living in, far inferior than the period before, for a number of reasons. And I'm not talking about physical comforts or physical health or all of the physical benefits that we've developed for ourselves. I'm talking about intellectual culture, religious culture, moral culture, things that pertain to the soul, which is more important than the body. And when we judge culture, we have to ask what effect the culture and its unique characteristics have on the soul, because that's ultimately what matters most. And I'm not promoting any dualistic idea of body and soul, but the body is corrupt and temporary, and the soul is eternal. And the body is going to be replaced by a glorified body for those who believe. And therefore the soul that's going to remain with us is more important. Its care and protection is more important than the care and protection of our bodies. We can sacrifice our body to save our soul. But we can't sacrifice our soul to save our body. And in modern society, that's what men are doing. They're sacrificing their souls to boast of the salvation of their bodies. And even in pre-Christian times, ancient men understood that the soul was more important than the body. If we understand that and judge culture, we'll find that the Middle Ages were the golden age of human history. And that continued until around 1500. I like to use the discovery of the New World as a chronological date post to help us keep things in perspective. There are many different events that we could use, but Columbus discovering the Americas around 1492, around 1500 is a good date post to mark a division. Another event that I like to use as a historical date post in my mind is the martyrdom of Thomas More, which took place in 1535. That's a key event in history, and having a collection of the key events and the dates of those events helps us to quickly think through and order historical events, which is helpful anytime we discuss any historical topic. So This medieval period that begins around 500 AD and continues until around 1500 AD contained the restoration, or I should say the perfection, of Christian philosophy under St. Thomas and the Scholastics in the 12th and 13th century. So you can put the publication of the Summa Theologica as another important date post. I believe it was published around 1267. I think St. Thomas died in 1274, so 1270 we can use as a rough date for the publication of the Summa and the academic work of St. Thomas. At that time, in the 13th century, we have the perfection of Christian philosophy, where Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy are brought together by St. Thomas Aquinas, who then explains to us how the Aristotelian doctrine helps us to solve many problems in Christian theology. You'll notice that in the Summa Theologica, St. Thomas refers to Aristotle as an authoritative source, which is pretty impressive, and refers to him as the philosopher. So 1300, we have St. Thomas Aquinas. I mean, just think about these things. Around 1300, you could go to the University of Paris in France and find St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure teaching at the university. Just before that time, we have some of the most significant and influential saints who ever lived. We have the period where we have St. Francis and St. Dominic and the foundation of the Franciscans and Dominicans, and we know their history and their tradition, how they have continued faithful now for 800 years. We have this golden age, I would say, in the 13th century, 12th and 13th centuries, where from St. Francis, St. Dominic, St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, I don't believe there's a collection of saints outside of maybe the early church fathers that can compare with that group of 12th and 13th century saints. And so we can see there that Catholic intellectual culture, we could even argue that Catholic spiritual culture overall really reached its peak at that time. And we can take away from it a few saints, St. Thomas, St. Dominic, St. Francis, St. Catherine of Siena, St. Bonaventure, St. Albert the Great. We can take a collection of names, just a small number of names, and use them to characterize and remember that period of 13th century European Catholicism. Really amazing time, referred to as the Higher Middle Ages. If you look at the book that I published, Understanding Classical Catholic Education, I talk about that period in detail. So I'll leave you to the book for that. But remember these these important date posts in chronology. The period of the Church Fathers in the 4th and 5th centuries in the early church. St. Jerome, St. Ambrose, St. Augustine, St. Gregory, and so on. St. John Chrysostom. That's 4th and 5th centuries. Some other influential names like John Cassian at that time. Then we have somewhat of a strong theological period from those church fathers, but unsettled philosophical period from those church fathers until the 12th and 13th century, when we see the rise of scholasticism. That marks the peak of Catholic intellectual culture, with St. Thomas as its representative. And then from there we go through the later Middle Ages until we come to the 1500s or so, when in world history we see on a number of different fronts a massive rebellion against that Catholic culture of the 13th century. We see it in two different manifestations, I would say, or two different movements that were separate but related because they shared common philosophical foundations. We see the rise of the scientific method, really formalized and moved forward by Francis Bacon in 1620 when he published the New Organon or Novum Organum. That was 1620. And in the Protestant Reformation, a century earlier, 1517, led by Martin Luther, John Calvin, and some others in Europe. So the discovery of the Americas, Christopher Columbus sailing in 1492, everyone has that event memorized usually. It's a good reference point. That was sort of the dawn of this modern new age, and it was quickly followed by the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the American Revolution, and so on. And we have this rebellion in the West against Catholic philosophy and authority, Catholic culture in general. But at that point, around 1500, that scholastic philosophy and learning had really continued to develop and peak. And one thing that was different in the 1500s from the 1300s is that in the 1500s, especially among the English and among the Jesuits who were organized around that same time, they really had developed and formalized Catholic schooling so that the learning of the 13th century, that scholastic learning, could be very efficiently delivered to students in a larger number than it was in the past. Throughout history, elite students were normally taught by tutors. There were no schools. The goal was to simply provide a gifted student who had financial resources and could afford studies to go to a grammar school to be immersed in the classical languages so that he was prepared to then go on to what was called university, where he would study the 7 liberal arts and get the Catholic scholastic education. That was very rare, though, throughout most of medieval history, but groups like the Jesuits and English schoolmasters around the time of Thomas More really began to systematize classical Catholic education and develop schools where larger numbers of students could attend and receive that quality of education. And that was coming to a peak right as the Reformation and Scientific Revolution took place and began the unraveling of everything that had been established. And we can talk about that a little more later. But there's a handful of English names that I will assume you've never heard of before or you're simply not very familiar with. And I'd like to give you these names, and I'd like to encourage you to learn more about them. In the description on this video, I'm going to post some links to their biographies. If you're interested in digging into them, I'll give you some links so that you can access PDF versions of their books that you can study for free. The names that I'd like to share, and all of these have an interesting connection to Thomas More. So if you're a Catholic and you're familiar with Thomas More, who's very popular as a saint, you should know that these men were all involved in his life, either as friends or as teachers. So these are important dudes. The first one that I would mention would be Thomas Linacre. Thomas Linacre. His last name is spelled Linacre. Thomas Linacre. Thomas Linacre was a physician or a doctor in the 1500s, And he was actually St. Thomas More's Greek tutor. So he taught St. Thomas More Greek. So when you hear about how amazingly skilled Thomas More was in classical languages and classical studies, he learned his Greek from Thomas Linacre. That's one name. And you can find a biography of Thomas Linacre. Another name is John Colet. John Colet, C-O-L-E-T, Colet. John Colet was employed by Thomas More to tutor his daughter in the classical languages. So John Colet was another Catholic classical schoolmaster of that period, and was, like I said, used by St. Thomas as a tutor. Thomas Linacre was actually a tutor to St. Thomas, but John Colet was a tutor employed by St. Thomas. Another one would be William Lilly. William Lilly, L-I-L-Y, was a famous classical schoolmaster who wrote a grammar textbook that was edited and contributed to by John Colet and Thomas More and others. And that Latin grammar book became the royal grammar of the King of England. It was the grammar book that Shakespeare studied and everyone else of that period. So William Lilly, it's referred to as Lilly's grammar. That's another name. So we've got Linacre, Colet, Lilly. A third one is William Grocyn, G-R-O-C-Y-N. William Grocyn was another of these classical English scholars at the time. And then I'd say Desiderius Erasmus. Desiderius Erasmus was central in that period as a man of great learning. And there's one more, I just had to look him up because I didn't have the name in mind anymore. William Latimer. William Latimer. He's another. So this list of names that I'd encourage you to look up, just to repeat them, it's Thomas Linacre, John Colet, William Lilly, William Grocyn, and William Latimer. A bunch of Williams in there. And then Desiderius Erasmus, and you should remember all of them as being linked in different ways to Thomas More. So if you love Thomas More and admire Thomas More, then all of these men should be of interest to you. As I said, what these men did was they brought this medieval scholastic education and joined it to English culture. And this is a real need in the modern church. All of this, and don't get offended as I say this, but just hear me out. If you'd like to argue it, I'm happy to argue it, but hear me out on this. In our generation, we see a lot of fuss about the Latin Mass, and there's this idea that beautiful Catholic culture is all tied to the Latin Mass. And if we get rid of the Latin Mass, we're going to lose all of this culture. And that's simply not true. The people who say that are people who don't know this history of classical English education. They falsely attach the beauty of this Tridentine culture. The Council of Trent, which is what Tridentine refers to. Tridentine refers to things established by the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was called in response to these movements that I'm talking about, these Protestant, modernist, scientific, anti-Catholic movements that developed in the 1500s. The Council of Trent was called to deal with the false ideas that were spreading at the time. And this is why it's significant to see that the Council of Trent directed men back to scholastic philosophy. Because scholastic philosophy was the true philosophical foundation for Catholic culture, and the heretical movements such as Protestantism that were developing were not just criticisms and rebellions against Catholicism. In fact, I would argue that the rebellion was much more serious on the philosophical level than on the theological level, that the rebellion against Catholicism was not as important as the rebellion against scholasticism. In modern circles, in our generation, this whole Protestant classical education movement is really like an oxymoron to say Protestants and classical education. Protestants destroyed classical education. It was Protestantism that ended classical education. Classical education belongs to the Catholic Church. It's scholastic. That's what classical Christian education is. It's scholasticism. Protestants trying to pretend that they're interested in studying Latin and classical studies only reveals the ignorance among the Protestants leading that movement, because they really don't understand the history or the philosophy behind classical Christian education. Nor do they care, because they're just selling books. And the worst thing about it is that Catholics, just having no foundation and to be honest, being lazy and not willing to do the work that they know they should do, when there's money to be made among ignorant customers as they see them, who aren't going to demand any historical evidence or even philosophical coherence in the things that are taught. This Catholic classical education movement, which we see in places like Mother of Divine Grace School and all the rest, they simply copied the Protestant classical education movement and really have no idea what they're talking about, because they haven't done the research. They're talking about Dorothy Sayers and these other ridiculous things. They don't understand the real history. If we want to know the truth about where classical Catholic education was in the 1500s, around the time of the Reformation, around the time of the discovery of the Americas, around the time of the scientific revolution, we should look at these names: Thomas Linacre, William Lilly, John Colet, Erasmus, Thomas More, and so on. We can go back in history, and this is how my study in classical Catholic education developed. When I was studying it as an undergraduate student, as a classics student, I was interested in the history of classical education. I wanted that education for myself. That's why I was interested in it. And I had the great benefit of having access to the Rutgers University and Princeton University libraries. Being a Rutgers classics student, the classics department of Rutgers and Princeton collaborated, so I had access to all of those resources. And what I was able to do was start, working backwards from the latest school books that I could find in English history back through the centuries, tracing them back to their sources. Another important book and author that I should mention while it's on my mind is a book by I think he lived in the 1400s. He was a schoolmaster named Roger Ascham, A-S-C-H-A-M, Roger Ascham. And he published a book that was called The Schoolmaster. The Schoolmaster. It's spelled S-C-H-O-L-E-M-A-S-T-E-R. It looks like Scholemaster. That was Roger Ascham. That was another important book in the history of classical Catholic education. So if we look back to those authors, those men who were actually the ones running these classical Catholic schools, and they brought those schools and established those schools into English culture, which provides us with a connection culturally. When the Catholics came to America, beginning in the 1500s, and we're talking about Dominicans, Franciscans, other missionary groups, Jesuits, people like that, they brought that learning and culture with them, and it was part of the means by which they evangelized and converted the people who were here and the people who came here after the discovery of the Americas. But that 15th and 16th century Catholic classical education was central to the Catholic culture, and the Protestants separated themselves from that culture and were eager to shake it off and get out from under it, because they had their own ideals of education that were based on the philosophical foundations of Protestantism. And a good name, an important name to keep in mind with this is John Comenius. John Comenius was a Protestant. He was an early Protestant, and he symbolizes the change in education that comes with Protestantism. I use John Comenius's Latin vocabulary book in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy just because it's helpful. But John Comenius was a central figure in leading Protestants away from scholastic education. And this is very easy to understand. It's easy to understand the philosophical differences between Protestant education and Catholic education because they all relate to the question of authority. They all relate to authority. Protestants reject Catholic authority, and once Catholic authority is rejected, you just run into theological chaos. There's no more order, there's no more structure, there's no more rule, there's no more certainty. Education just becomes, or all culture just becomes some form of democracy, where the people decide what they want to do, and that just becomes the norm. What happened in the 1500s and 1600s was that the Protestants, as they separated themselves from Catholics, they brought with them a lot of inherited Catholic culture, but they slowly worked to unravel themselves from it and separate themselves from it. They consider that to be a success, but ultimately it's what leads to their destruction. We could think of it as living with inherited capital, like a rich kid who inherits a fortune living after his successful business-minded father passes away. This kid has all kinds of appearances of wealth and culture, but they're really just borrowed, and they're dwindling because he's not going to restore them. He's not going to maintain them. That was the culture of Protestantism in the 1500s. They were impressive to look at, but what was impressive about that early Protestant culture was that it was Catholic. And as those Protestants separated themselves from Catholicism, everything that was good about them was slowly abandoned. Once that the authority of the Catholic Church was abandoned, the systematic scholastic education that was established by the Catholic Church was replaced by what we can call an encyclopedic learning. Encyclopedic learning. We moved away from the classical liberal arts, which were studied because it was assumed that the Aristotelian philosophy was to be studied. And the way that you prepare for the study of Aristotelian philosophy is through the study of the 7 liberal arts. Once the Protestants, and we'll call them Baconians, B-A-C-O-N for Francis Bacon, once the Baconians and the Protestants abandoned Catholicism and rebelled against church authority, there was no longer a need to study or a desire to study the 7 liberal arts, because there was no longer an interest in studying Aristotelian philosophy or scholastic philosophy, theology. And that 7 liberal arts system of education, which was inscribed in the walls of the English buildings at the time, painted on monastery walls, that system of education was abandoned by those Protestants and scientific revolutionaries, we might call them, and replaced with encyclopedic learning that now is normal in education. When we want to show off a smart kid today, we say, oh, look, he's only 9 years old and he can name all the muscles and bones of the body. Look how smart he is. He's got encyclopedic knowledge. And even this modern age of this information age, it's all about encyclopedic knowledge. Google is the word that sort of represents what we call learning in the modern world. But it wasn't thought of that way in the Catholic world. And this is why modern society refers to Catholic culture as the Dark Age, because they didn't have this kind of useless, idle, encyclopedic information. They studied the classical liberal arts. They studied Aristotelian philosophy. They studied authoritative Catholic theology. The philosophy of the Catholic Middle Ages determined what was studied and how it was studied. And that's what classical Catholic education is. But when these revolutions against that Catholic culture developed, that system of education was abandoned and replaced with encyclopedic studies, math studies, science studies, all of these things related to this Protestant and scientific revolution against Catholic culture. When we look at that period of history and we see those movements and that change in education, this is why it's really significant for us to look at the Jesuits. The Jesuits were getting started in the mid-1500s, and they published their Ratio Studiorum, the rule of studies, for their schools, which were central to their mission. They published the Ratio Studiorum, which taught the scholastic system of education and formalized it into basically a school handbook. That's why this document, the Ratio, is so important for us. The Jesuits systematized, they codified classical Catholic education. And they did so that they could take it as missionaries and bring it everywhere they went. They established classical Catholic schools as the remedy to Protestantism and this scientific thinking. Let me block a call real quick. So this Jesuit movement with this missionary school activity was pursued because the Jesuits understood very clearly that what was under attack in the 1500s was Catholic education. Catholic education, even more than the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith itself, that's not all that was under attack. Catholic education and culture itself were under attack by those movements because they belonged to a certain philosophical position that was rejected by the Catholic Church and contrary to Catholic or scholastic philosophy. The Jesuits went intentionally to establish classical, Catholic, scholastic, Aristotelian, Ciceronian schools as a safeguard against Protestantism. It's very important for us to see that at that time, the saints, men like St. Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, and the rest, they understood that Catholic education was under attack and schools needed to be established with clearly defined curriculum standards and methods and sources for the education of Catholic children. And we see tons of activity at that time where these saintly Jesuits were working to publish textbooks to systematize that learning which was in danger and under attack by the Protestants and these modern scientific revolutionaries. The ratio studiorum, therefore, is very important. What was going on in England at the time was very important. This conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism took place in the person of the king himself in England. In King Henry VIII, this dilemma, this battle between these two forces, the Catholic Church, scholastic theology, Aristotelian philosophy, this classical Catholic education and culture was present on one side, and on the other side was this new Baconian, Protestant, anti-Catholic, secular, modern culture. And these two sides came to battle, and they went to war in the person of King Henry VIII, who went from a faithful Catholic to a Protestant heretic and excommunicant within a decade. His execution of St. Thomas More is a symbol of the deeper event of that period, which was the attempt by this modern movement to exterminate Catholicism. We don't think about this enough, but do you realize that, and maybe you know this history and this is common knowledge, but most parents don't. Do you know that when King Henry VIII converted, or I shouldn't say converted, when he apostatized from Catholicism and became a Protestant, not only did he put saints to death, but do you know that he actually banished all monks and nuns from England and seized control of all of the English monasteries that were established through centuries and centuries of Catholic culture? He basically rooted all Catholic monastic culture, all Catholic culture, out of England in the 1500s. That movement, that anti-Catholic movement of the Scientific Revolution and the Protestant Reformation are personified in King Henry VIII. Their vanity and futility is also signified in King Henry VIII. He ended up accomplishing nothing except destroying everything that existed before him. St. Thomas More signifies the Catholic resistance to that movement, the Catholic resistance to Protestantism and this modern anti-scholastic scientific revolution. At the same time, we have the controversies of Galileo going on, with the church resisting this heliocentric theory proposed by Galileo. And while we like to criticize that and pretend that the church was wrong for opposing Galileo, we don't seem to realize that the leader of the opposition against Galileo was St. Robert Bellarmine. And so it wasn't some, crazy cuckoo from the Middle Ages who was resisting Galileo. It was one of the most learned and famous saints in church history who was resisting Galileo. And the reason why was because this was a theory that Galileo was proposing in the name of science, of course, and Galileo is often presented to us as the sort of father figure of this scientific revolution, even though really philosophically it was Francis Bacon. But Bellarmine resisted Galileo because Galileo was suggesting that we just throw away this classical Catholic culture and replace it with a theory that had no evidence. It had not yet been demonstrated to even be true. Robert Bellarmine said, no, we can't throw away this entire established tradition of natural philosophy that we've possessed, which is harmonious with sacred scripture, which agrees with Catholic theology. We're not going to throw this system of natural philosophy out and just drink in your theory about how the universe is arranged. You need to show us proof. We're going to stick with tradition unless it's proven to be impossible. And Galileo never provided any such proof, and consequently Bellarmine rejected his proposal. Galileo then disobeyed the church and went on to publish it as if it was scientific fact, and for that he was threatened with excommunication. So that period is a period of turmoil, and what I want you to really see is that the battle at that time, sure, it was between the Catholic Church and the Protestants, but even more deeply, and this is where I think modern Catholics have really missed the whole problem, and they're actually caught up in the problem themselves, not aware of what they're doing. But it was a battle between two systems of philosophy that were represented by two systems of education. On the one side, it was the seven liberal arts, Aristotelian philosophy, and scholastic theology, classical Catholic education. And on the other side, it was this modern math and science, encyclopedic learning that was opposed to Catholic culture. And I should say, when I mention math and science, the key figure to think about there is Isaac Newton. He published a book titled The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which is where this whole modern math and science curriculum started. It started in Newton's mathematical principles. So Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, John Comenius, Martin Luther, all of those guys represent this anti-Catholic philosophical, cultural, educational movement. Thomas More, St. Ignatius of Loyola, Thomas Linacre, John Colet, these guys represent at least the English resistance to the revolution. We have to understand that that was the nature of the battle, the Jesuits really being the manifestation of the Catholic fight against this modern educational philosophy. We have that fight going on in Europe, and I'm talking primarily about England. And then we have the discovery of the Americas. And in the 1700s, we have the establishment of this idea of a democratic nation. We have the Declaration of Independence, we have the American Constitution, and now we have a society that is founded upon these modern scientific and Protestant principles. No reference at all to the Catholic Church, complete separation of this new state from the existing church. That's the separation of church and state. It's the separation of the state from the Catholic Church that took place at that time. And we have this idea that whatever the people want is going to be the law of the land. And this, of course, fits in perfectly with the scientific revolution and Protestant revolution or rebellion against the authority of the Catholic Church. This philosophy comes to America and sets its roots in America. And America is dominated by Protestant and modern groups, especially in New England. This Protestant education, Protestant scientific education, this encyclopedic anti-Catholic education comes in and establishes itself as American education. In the 1800s, the public school system is established, and that system of education, which was developed in 1500s, 1600s, 1700s in Europe by these Protestant and scientific anti-Catholic groups, that is established as the public education in America. That's the American system of education. It's this secular, scientific, anti-Catholic, and at that time, Protestant education. The Protestants themselves were deceived by it because they were ultimately spit out of it. But they were useful in getting it established. That then becomes the official legal educational system in America, which provokes the Council of Baltimore, the Archdiocese of Baltimore in the 1850s, to be organized because the bishops are realizing that this anti-Catholic educational system is being established and subsidized by the American government, and that's what brings about the development of the American Catholic parochial school system. But the fatal error of this parochial school system is that they embrace much of this modern education and the structure of the schools. They try to imitate the schools, the government schools, without the funding of the government schools. They set up these K-12 type modern schools, this big school system. They staff it with immigrant nuns and priests, which is not a sustainable source of teachers and school leaders. It runs for a generation or so and then slowly begins to die because it wasn't a sustainable plan. It was established in the 1850s, and by the 1960s already began to decline. So we're talking a century. And in our day, in 2020 or so, there are half the number of students in Catholic schools as there were in 1960. So that parochial school system was a bubble that was unsustainable. It was an attempt to resist the secular, Protestantish, scientific, democratic, anti-Catholic. I could go on with all these qualifications, but it was an attempt to resist that and provide a Catholic alternative. But the parochial school system wasn't itself free enough from this modern thinking to actually establish a sustainable school model, and it collapsed. And we're seeing the sort of the slow death of the American parochial system, which is only 150 or so years old. It barely survived. It's not going to survive 200 years. But it doesn't really matter because that's not the historic school model anyway. The historical school model is the classical Catholic education. And for some reason, the Catholic schools have tried to embrace this mathematical, scientific, encyclopedic learning. And that's what you see in the modern schools. In the modern Catholic schools, you see basically Protestantish, scientific education that we gloss with some kind of Catholic religion on top, and it just doesn't work. The classical Catholic education that was abandoned by the Protestants was also, in some strange way, abandoned by the Catholics. And so what was lost was that tradition of classical Catholic education, almost as if the Catholics in America were embarrassed by it. And they were, it seems, afraid to go against the grain too much in America. But that system of education was lost, and that's the system of education that I have worked to recover and restore in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And so in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, what you can find is that old Catholic system of education, the 7 liberal arts, Aristotelian philosophy, Scholastic theology, that was in place in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, but was eventually abandoned as this Protestant scientific movement developed, and that was really accelerated by the rise of the theory of evolution by Darwin, which became popular at the same time that the public schools were developing, which was sort of the spirit of that age, this desire to not only abandon Catholicism, but even to abandon the doctrine of creation itself, which is why, again, the modern school system, the American system, basically betrayed the Protestants and eventually spit them out. So the Protestants got what they deserved for trying to take up the sword of secular power and fight against Catholicism with it. They ended up with nothing. But the restoration of this classical Catholic education is the work that I'm engaged in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and by God's grace, we've been at it full-time for 15 years, and I'm urging Catholics to understand these events in history, because Catholics in modern America, and I know we're getting long here, I'm going to wrap this up. Catholics in modern America don't really seem to understand the nature of the problem and what went wrong, where things fell apart. That's why this Latin Mass movement has gained some traction. There are people who know that something is wrong, but they don't know what's wrong. And if you get a couple charismatic leaders in this Latin Mass group, you can propose a solution to what the problem is and say, oh, you know what the problem is? In the Second Vatican Council, they changed the Mass, and ever since then, all hell's broken loose. That's not true. That's not true. The evil broke loose way before the Second Vatican Council. And if you understand what actually happened in history and in America and throughout the world, and then look at the Second Vatican Council, you'll see the Second Vatican Council is working to address the chaos that has erupted ever since these movements took place in the 1500s and worked themselves out in modern society, especially by means of democracy, which is just, let all the, everything that held society together has been cut loose. But this Latin Mass movement, which is has gained traction because people know something is wrong, is just a lazy and superficial response to the problem, because the problem goes much deeper. And you can see the problem with this Latin Mass movement. And again, don't be upset if you hear me criticizing this movement and you are, if you belong to this Latin Mass movement that talks against the Vatican, the Second Vatican Council, and against Pope Francis, and if you've been caught up in this, just listen to what I'm explaining, because your awareness that something is wrong is true, but what you're blaming as the problem and the cause is not true. You're aware that something is, that there's a disease, but your diagnosis is wrong. The cause of the trouble has nothing to do with the Second Vatican Council or the Latin Mass, and you've allowed yourself to get caught up in that silliness with some shallow thinkers that are, charismatic, and they're very aggressive. Guys like Michael Voris, Taylor Marshall, some of these other characters that are very active, very vocal. They can publish a book a week, it seems, just all of this content, book sales and stuff. They've allowed this false remedy to get some traction, but it's just shallow and ultimately ignorant. You've got to go deeper. And the way that you can see that Latin Mass movement is a counterfeit of the real solution is that once you get outside of liturgical discussions and you get into discussions about culture or education, they have nothing to offer. They're clueless. They're clueless. I just had a family move into the Classical Liberal Arts Academy from a so-called traditional Catholic curriculum program because they were tired of studying Protestant books in this traditional Catholic curriculum. They really don't know what they're doing because they really don't understand the nature of the problem, because they really haven't done the work to investigate it and find out where we went off the rails. The Latin Mass is not the solution. If we look at the Dominicans, who are the Thomists and the Scholastics in the church, they have no real concern about the Latin Mass. They pray the Liturgy of the Hours, celebrate the Novus Ordo. That's not the problem. The problem is this deeper philosophical movement, which the traditional Latin Mass crowd is actually caught up in themselves, which is why the words coming out of their mouths are almost copied and pasted from the Protestant reformers. Criticizing the Pope, rejecting councils, talking about an apostasy. This is just the same era of Protestantism because they're really not getting to the root of the disease, but are still affected by it themselves. We have to go back to the system of education that was established as a result of the work of Thomas Aquinas and the establishment of scholasticism. We have to go back to the system of education in the 7 classical liberal arts, Aristotelian philosophy, and Catholic theology. This is what we were called to by Pope Leo XIII in his encyclical on the restoration of Christian philosophy. Go read it. It's what we were called to by Pope Pius X in his encyclical against modernism. It was not a call back to the Latin Mass or a warning that the Latin Mass was in danger. That's not what Pope Pius X was concerned with. He was concerned with the abandonment of scholasticism. That's what he warned about. He was concerned about the content of the teaching in the seminaries, and that something was replacing the traditional Catholic philosophy and theology. The modernism refers back to this Protestantish science and math, scientific revolution, Baconian, Newtonian, Darwinian philosophy and education. That's the danger. That's modernism. And many people in this traditional Catholic culture who are talking about having PhDs or theology degrees from academic institutions that have nothing to do with the magisterium or authority of the church, they themselves are wrapped up in the modernism that Pope Pius X and Leo XIII warned about, thinking that because they have an academic degree and no actual authoritative role in the church, that they're qualified by their academic degree to criticize the Pope and bishops. That's what modernism is. They think that because they're arguing for the Latin Mass, that they can't possibly be modernists. But philosophically, what they're doing is the problem of modernism. When secular sources with encyclopedic learning based on this mathematical and scientific modern academic system imagine that their knowledge, in the words of Francis Bacon, their knowledge is power, that's modernism. So saying, I have a degree in theology, therefore I'm going to speak against the Pope, as if this academic theology degree is anything more than a certificate I bought by paying tuition and not failing courses in a university or seminary program. That is modernism. It doesn't matter that you're arguing for the Latin Mass. That's modernism. Arguing against the authority of the Catholic Church with the Protestants, with the scientists of the revolution, the scientific revolution. That idea that I can contradict the Pope and bishops who make up the magisterium, who are the interpreters of sacred scripture and sacred tradition, that I can contradict them because I have an academic degree from Joe Schmo University. Even if it's if you say, oh, well, it's a Catholic university, that makes even less sense because now you're appealing to the authority of the church, which you're disagreeing with, as the source of your academic credential. The insanity, the self-contradictions of this movement and the shallowness of it when you investigate and poke around and dig into it, to see that there's all this fuss about a form of worship, of liturgy, and nothing beyond that. There's no educational philosophy. There's no explanation of deeper things. It's just this superficial, ignorant, conspiracy theory movement. Go get your infiltration book and read about how the traditional church was infiltrated by communists and homosexuals. It's silliness. It's silliness. And it attracts conspiracy theorists because they always want to feel like they're part of the inner circle that knows the truth. It's shallow silliness. If you want to get to the real issue is the abandonment of scholastic theology, which depends on Aristotelian philosophy, which depends on the classical 7 liberal arts. That's the real problem. You can go from school to school in America, they're all doing the same thing. It doesn't matter if you're in a public school. It doesn't matter if you're at a Catholic school. It doesn't matter if you're in a pro-Latin Mass Catholic school. It doesn't matter if you're in a Protestant school. They're all doing the same thing. It's math and science, encyclopedic learning, no regard for church authority. That's modern education. It doesn't matter what you call it or what pictures you put on the walls or who runs it, whether it's Catholic or non-Catholic. That is the problem in modern education. And the restoration of the classical liberal arts, Aristotelian philosophy, and scholastic theology is the solution. We can see this, and this is the point of this talk, we can see this battle between these two forces most clearly at the time of the Reformation. But it's not just the Reformation. It's deeper than that. It's also the scientific revolution. It's also Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, Charles Darwin a couple hundred years later. It's more than just the Protestant Reformation. In fact, I would argue that the scientific method and the thinking of Francis Bacon, that idea of a free and independent investigation of the world with no regard for any tradition or history, is actually the spirit behind Protestantism, which just applies it to religion. The bigger issue is that scientific approach, that encyclopedic idea of learning where we just go into the world and we start collecting facts, and we think that because we know more facts about these plants or about those rocks or that planet or that star, that we're now superior and we're the judges of the Pope and bishops of the church. That is the error of modernism, that encyclopedic learning, scientific investigation of the material world gives us the authority to judge the Catholic Church and the hierarchy of the church. That's modernism. It's present in all modern schools. The restoration of the classical liberal arts, Aristotelian philosophy, and scholastic theology, that is, I'm going to go to my grave saying this, and I really believe that at this point in time, I may be the only person saying this. The restoration of the classical liberal arts, which you can find in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, is the remedy for this modern dilemma. It's not the Latin Mass. That's going to prove to be a dead movement that ends up leading people into schism or something foolish like that. It's not simply cleaning up a Catholic school or reforming a Catholic school, moving the desks around and saying, there, now we've changed some things. That's not going to fix the problem. The problem is philosophical. It's deeper than that, and the whole system of education has to be restored that leads us to that philosophy, which leads us to that theology. That system is essential to Catholic culture. And until we restore it, as parents in our home schools, as lay people in local Catholic schools, or God willing, by the religious in the church's schools, this mess is just going to continue. And we're going to be like people living in a house filled with poisonous gas, always sick, always coughing and sneezing and feeling terrible, and not able to figure out what the problem is. This, I argue, is the problem. And when we fix this cause, when we remove this cause, I believe that we'll see health restored and Catholic culture restored. I recommend, for anyone interested, that you study and focus on this period in English history, the period of the English Reformation, the life of Thomas More, the life of King Henry VIII, the mission of the Jesuits in Spain as it arises at the same time, the teaching and work of Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint John of the Cross, and the Carmelites at the same time, the work of Erasmus and Thomas More and Thomas Linacre and William Lilly and John Colet in education in England at this same time. Understand what those men and women were fighting for and why, and realize that we're not fighting the fight that they were fighting in our generation. We're not understanding the problem as they understood it while they watched it happen in real time in their own generation. We're fighting things that are irrelevant and leaving the cause untouched. So I hope that that's helpful, and I hope that I can inspire you to devote some time to studying these characters and these events at the time of the English Reformation and of the scientific revolution. Because if you do, you'll begin to see the things that I'm talking about. And in the meantime, I'd like to invite you to join me in studying in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and also I'd like to ask you to help me in promoting the work of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I really believe that we're restoring this system of education, and I really believe that when Catholics come around to understand what we're doing and to engage with it, to embrace it, and to pursue it, I think we're going to see a restoration of Catholic culture, a revival of religious vocations, and in general, a renewal of Catholic intellectual culture. I can't say anything about Catholic spiritual culture because that's dependent on the grace of God. But Catholic intellectual culture, Catholic philosophical culture can definitely be renewed and restored by the restoration of the Classical Liberal Arts. So please, join us in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Come and learn more. Get a free copy of the book, Understanding Classical Catholic Education, and explore these things. I leave you to the evidence. Learn about these people, learn about these events, and discuss with me this question of what the real cause of the trouble is in modern society. I think this is it. God bless.